Welcome to the Happiness Podcast. I'm Dr. Robert Puff. Change. There's been a lot of change lately in our world. I bet you've noticed. I sure have. And the most important way life has changed is that life, our world, is becoming more complex. And the complexity of life is shifting faster. And no matter what age we are, we're seeing these changes. Yes, we can use a lot of examples with our parents and our grandparents of how different things are to them now than it was when they were growing up. But even now, if you're younger, you've seen changes, and they come quickly, and they come fast, and they're coming more often. I've been doing this podcast for a while now, and you may not have heard it, but I did a podcast on the movie Transcendence with Johnny Depp. It's about how in the future AI becomes conscious and begins to change our world. Well, podcasts themselves haven't been around that long. Mine is one of the older ones because I've been doing it for about 10 years now. But I want to share a story that just happened to me. I have to, as a business, fill out a census bureau where I talk about my business and what I'm doing and things that I'm using to make my business grow and keep doing better. And interestingly, when I got this census from the government, they asked me a lot of questions, and I would say about 25 to 50% of the questions were how I was implementing AI, artificial intelligence, in my line of work. I produced that podcast right when the movie came out, and if you want to listen to it, it's episode 36, called Transcendence, and it's produced on March 28th, 2014. Well, that's about 8 years ago at the time of this recording. And now, 8 years later, which was a movie concept at the time, is now being investigated, being studied by the US government to find out how AI is being used in businesses today. That is a lot of change very quickly. And there's so many examples. I'm sure we can all think of many of them. Change does seem to be the new norm. Our world is changing fast. And this is just one of a plethora of examples that I can give. Just recently, in Southern California, where I live, we had a hurricane. The first hurricane that I can remember since I've lived in Southern California. There are just so many examples of how our world is changing, and it's changing fast, and it keeps changing faster. And this is not going to change. The one thing that's going to stay the same is change. And I believe that change is going to get faster and faster. Our world is going to be very different 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. But we're here to find happiness. So let's take a deep breath and pause and say, okay, I get it. Our world is changing. That is an absolute guarantee. And it can potentially create a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of worry. But there are ways that we can work against these anxieties and learn that we do not have to live with these. Instead, we can find peace and happiness no matter what. So let's talk about what can we do with all the changes in our world. How can we change with them well? The first thing that's going to cause us anxiety and stress is fighting the change. If we say, I don't want this change, I don't want it, go away, we're going to suffer. We're going to have a hard time. We're going to be anxious. Or we're going to be mad because change is in many ways the new norm. And given that, if we fight that change, we are going to suffer. It doesn't mean we need to embrace the change. What it means is we need to realize that change is part of life now, and we need to learn how to adapt. And one of the best ways to adapt to change is to acknowledge, yes, there is change in the world. I agree to that. And instead of fighting that change, I'm going to find ways to make my life go well, given that there is so much change. And there's a lot of ways we can acknowledge the change and choose not to embrace the change. For example, we may choose to go live off the grid. We may find a cabin up in the mountains and live very simply, and that's okay. People do that. We may not get involved in every new technology out there, and when cars change, we may keep our old car and just fix it for many years because we like it. We like the way it runs, and we don't like a computer running our car. There's many ways that we don't have to fight the change, and we can choose not to go with the change. But it is a choice. It's not that we're fighting the change. We're just choosing to say, given this new change is out there, this new option that I have is out there, I choose to do this instead. We can make those choices. But when we fight change, no, I want to get really upset and get angry over these changes, it's going to be harder. So the key of life in this situation is realizing that yes, there is changes, and yes, we're going to need to make choices about these changes. Those are the two things that are inevitable. But we get it stressed when we fight that we have to make the choice. There are times where choices are thrust upon us. You and I probably are not going to stop the climate changes we're seeing in our world. Because the oceans in Southern California are getting hotter, I probably will see more hurricanes in the future. And I may need to make changes with my home so that when the hurricanes come, I can better protect my house from all that rain and winds. I have a California home. I'm not used to those type of changes, so I will need to make changes if I'm going to adapt well. I don't have to. I may choose to move. That's a choice I can make. I may let the hurricane come and just rebuild again. That's another choice. But that's the key. Life, when there's change, creates choices. That's inevitable. What isn't inevitable, which we have a lot of control over, 100% control over, is how we choose to respond to these choices. Will we fight them? Will we get angry that they're thrust upon us? Or we say, okay, I see 3 choices before me, I'll choose option 2. And we can get mad, we can get upset over that we have to make this choice, but the choice is going to be made because some choices are thrust upon us and we just have to choose them. We have to choose to rebuild, we have to choose to move, we have to choose to do chemotherapy or not do chemotherapy. And then sometimes life gives us no choice. With complexity, sometimes things change so much, there really aren't any choices but the one before us. That's the only one we're able to choose. And so how we make that go well is saying, okay, I get it. I have no option but to move. I have no option but to replace my car because my state is requiring me to get an electric car. You know the options. There's many, many times in life where we don't have very many choices. Sometimes none. And sometimes too many choices. But the key of it is, how do we handle these choices? Do we fight them because there's none to make? Do we fight them because it's overwhelming? There's too many choices. Do we fight them because the change is just coming so quickly, it overwhelms us? Or do we say instead, thank you, life, for giving me this choice or these choices. Help me, life, to make the best choice and to respond with equanimity and peace. And let me embrace whatever choice is before me well and live well with this choice. That's the key of living in an anxious world, is by flowing with life and not fighting life so much. When we fight life, we do suffer. It's one of the main themes I teach on this happiness podcast. We need to stop fighting. It doesn't mean we can't make choices. It doesn't mean we can't stand up for what's right and what we believe in. But we do it calmly. We do it without anxiety because we know we're going to need to make choices. And as our world becomes more complex, we're going to need to make more choices. But we don't have to fight these choices. They're just part of life. We all go through seasons of time when a lot of change is happening. Sometimes that change is in the world and external. Sometimes that change is in our personal life and all around us. But change is, in many ways, the new norm. And it's something that we don't have to be anxious about. We may live in an anxious world, but we do not have to embrace that anxiety because we're developing tools of how to embrace and flow with that change instead of fighting that change. When we do fight change, we will suffer, and we don't need to. That is a choice. We cannot choose to stop the change in our world. That's coming. Some of the changes we may even like, medical advances, scientific advances, and often change is that way. It doesn't have to be bad. Change is just part of life. The difference for us living today is it's just coming more quickly. And many of these changes will be wonderful. Some of them will be challenging. But what will make them go well for us is stop fighting them, learning to make the choices we need to make when we do. Often we don't, but sometimes we'll need to. And stop saying, why is this changing? Because life changes. And then the second thing we can do that really is helpful with dealing with the anxiety in the world is learning to focus on the here and now. Because we tend to get overwhelmed when we think too much about the future. Because it is overwhelming. With all the changes happening in our world, who knows what it's going to look like 5-10 years from now. Given that, we don't need to focus on that as much. We mostly just need to focus on what we need to do today. And sometimes, just right now, what would make right now go well for us. And that's what we focus on. And that makes life so much easier and less overwhelming. So 10 years when I'm still doing this podcast, if you go back to this one 10 years from now, the advice will still be the same. It's not going to change. We suffer when we take too much on, when we're tackling too many things and we get overwhelmed. We stop suffering when we take one thing at a time, because there's always one thing we can do to make our situation better, to make it less overwhelming. And that approach to life is truly the secret sauce of a happy life, because then it avoids the anxiety from being overwhelmed. When we're truly focused on just one thing, one decision before us, we can do extremely well. But what tends to overwhelm us is when we think about the 10 next things we have to do. That overwhelms us. So let's not go there. We can have a list of what we need to do, of the things we need to focus on, but mostly we just focus on the one thing before us. And I want to end with one very helpful technique that can make life go so much better. In life, sometimes we have to make bigger decisions. Maybe we have to buy a car. Maybe we have to move. Maybe we have a wedding coming. Maybe we have to choose which college we're going to go to. But these are big choices that take a lot of energy, a lot of work and concentration. I would suggest doing that one thing first and waiting until that thing is completely done before going on to the next big task. This can be so helpful. I just used it and I use it often. I had a used car that I needed to sell, and I sell it myself, so it's a bit of work. And I also need to get a new computer because my computer is getting a little bit older. So instead of trying to do both tasks at the same time, I chose to sell my car first, which I did last weekend, I'm very glad to say. And then the next task I'll work on is getting my next computer and updating all the information onto it. Again, a challenging task, but one that's very manageable because I'm just focused on that. We do better when we focus on one thing at a time, and when we have big decisions to make that will take a lot of time and effort. If we can, let's try to do one at a time and wait until it's completely done and then tackle the next thing. It tends to work better when people take on too many tasks. It really can be overwhelming. So yes, we do live in an ever-changing world, and I believe that change is going to become more quick-paced and faster as time goes on. But the good news is we can ride that wave so well. We can handle these changes with equanimity and peace. When we stop fighting the changes, when we make one decision at a time, and when we have big decisions, if possible, do one at a time also. Then we'll find that though we may be living in an anxious world, we are living well. Thank you for joining me on the Happiness Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, please go to happinesspodcast.org. And until next time, accept what is, love what is.